My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 23 years I've been the family ghost. Not literally, of course. I wish I could disappear that easily during family gatherings, but in every way that mattered, I might as well have been invisible to the Mitchell clan. Growing up in suburban Denver, Colorado, I learned early that being the youngest of 7 grandchildren meant being the afterthought. While my cousins, Brad, Jessica, Michael, and the twins Emma and Ethan, basked in the spotlight of family attention, I sat in corners, watching life happen around me like I was behind glass. The Mitchell family gatherings were legendary in our neighborhood. Every major holiday, birthday, and occasion brought together what seemed like half of Colorado in my grandmother's sprawling Victorian house on Maple Street. Grandma Rose had built an empire from a small bakery she started in the 1970s, and by the time I was old enough to understand money, she owned 3 successful locations across Denver. But success came with its own set of politics, and in the Mitchell family, politics meant everything. My Uncle David, the eldest son, had always positioned himself as the heir apparent. He'd joined Grandma's business straight out of college, working his way up from delivery driver to operations manager. His wife, Patricia, made sure everyone knew about David's contributions at every family dinner. David saved the downtown location during the recession. Patricia would announce to anyone within earshot, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wine glass. Without him, Rose Bakery would have folded years ago. Then there was my Aunt Linda, Grandma's only daughter, who had chosen the path of academia over business. She was a professor of literature at the University of Colorado, and she never let anyone forget it. Her husband, Robert, was a successful attorney, and their children, my cousins Jessica and Michael, were the golden children who could do no wrong. Education is the real inheritance, Linda would counter Patricia's business talk. Knowledge and culture last forever. Buildings can burn down, but wisdom is eternal. My own parents, Mark and Jennifer, were the middle children in every sense. Dad worked as a middle manager at a tech company. Mom was a part-time nurse. We lived in a modest ranch house in Thornton, a far cry from my cousins' addresses in Cherry Hills Village and Highlands Ranch. During family gatherings, I watched this dance of competition play out while I helped Grandma Rose in the kitchen. While my cousins discussed their internships at law firms, their acceptance to prestigious universities, or their latest business ventures, I quietly washed dishes and listened to Grandma's stories about the old days. "You know, Sarah," Grandma would say, her weathered hands kneading bread dough with practiced precision, "success isn't always about being the loudest voice in the room." I was 16 when I first realized how deep the family's disregard for me ran. It was Thanksgiving 2017, and the entire family had gathered at Grandma's house. The November air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter. Inside, the house buzzed with conversation and the clatter of serving dishes. I had spent all morning helping Grandma prepare the feast, a spread that would make any restaurant jealous. Turkey, ham, 3 different types of stuffing, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce made from scratch, and enough pies to feed a small army. When it came time to sit down, I discovered there was no place set for me at the main table. Not an oversight, a deliberate exclusion. "Oh, Sarah," my cousin Jessica said with false sweetness, not even looking up from her phone. "There's a spot at the kids' table in the kitchen." The kids' table. I was 16, older than my cousin Emma. But because I wasn't considered important enough, I was relegated to sitting with the actual children, my 8-year-old second cousin Tommy and 6-year-old Lucy. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, but before I could say anything, Grandma Rose appeared beside me. "Sarah will be sitting right here," she announced firmly, pulling out the chair next to her own at the head of the table. "She's been my sous chef all morning, and a chef deserves a place of honor." The table fell silent. Uncle David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Aunt Linda raised an eyebrow. My parents looked uncomfortable, as they always did when family tensions surfaced. But Grandma didn't back down. She placed her hand on my shoulder, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: protection. Someone was standing up for me. That evening, as the family dispersed and the house grew quiet, I stayed behind to help Grandma clean up. It was our tradition, one that had developed naturally over the years. While everyone else rushed home to their comfortable lives, I remained, scrubbing pots and storing leftovers. "They don't mean to exclude you," Grandma said quietly as we worked side by side in her kitchen. The dishwasher hummed softly, and the house creaked with the settling of old wood. Yes, they do, I replied, surprising myself with my honesty. I'm not smart enough like Jessica and Michael. I'm not business-minded like Brad. I'm not accomplished like the twins. I'm just ordinary. Grandma Rose stopped loading the dishwasher and turned to face me fully. At 78, she still commanded attention when she wanted it. Her silver hair was pulled back in its customary bun, and her blue eyes, the same color as mine, held an intensity that made you feel like she could see straight into your soul. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, she said, using my full name the way she did when she was about to impart something important. Ordinary is not a word I would ever use to describe you. You have something your cousins don't have. What's that? I asked, genuinely curious. You see people, really see them. You notice when someone's quiet at dinner because they're struggling. You remember everyone's favorite dessert. You ask about things that matter. That's not ordinary, sweetheart. That's rare. I wanted to believe her, but years of being overlooked had built walls around my heart that her words couldn't immediately break down. The pattern continued through high school and into college. While my cousins attended prestigious universities, Jessica at Yale, Michael at Stanford, the twins at Northwestern, I enrolled at the University of Colorado, Denver, living at home to save money and working part-time at a local coffee shop to help pay for tuition. Family gatherings became exercises in endurance. I would arrive, help Grandma prepare food, eat dinner while listening to updates about my cousin's impressive achievements, clean up afterward, and drive home feeling smaller than when I'd arrived. But something began to change during my junior year of college. Maybe it was maturity, or maybe it was finally finding my voice in my communications classes, but I started to notice things about my family that I hadn't seen before or had chosen to ignore. I saw how Uncle David's business success came at the cost of his relationship with his son Brad, who felt constantly pressured to live up to impossible expectations. I watched Aunt Linda's perfectionism create anxiety in Jessica and Michael that they tried to hide behind their achievements. I noticed how the twins, Emma and Ethan, competed so fiercely with each other that they'd forgotten how to simply enjoy being siblings. And I saw how my parents, caught in the middle, had learned to make themselves smaller to avoid the conflicts that seemed to follow the Mitchell family wherever they went. During this time, my relationship with Grandma Rose deepened. Our after-dinner conversations became the highlight of family gatherings for me. She would tell me stories about building her business, about the mistakes she'd made, the lessons she'd learned, and the dreams she still harbored. You know, she told me one evening as we sat in her living room, the glow from her fireplace casting dancing shadows on the walls. I built this business not just for money, but because I wanted to create something that would bring people together. Food has a way of doing that. It speaks to something fundamental in all of us. Is that why you always cook so much for family gatherings? I asked. She smiled, but there was sadness in it. I keep hoping that if I feed them well enough, they'll remember what it means to be a family. But somewhere along the way, they started seeing each other as competition instead of allies. That conversation happened 3 months before everything changed. 3 months before the phone call that would turn my invisible existence upside down and force my family to finally see me, not as the overlooked youngest granddaughter, but as the one person Grandma Rose had been watching all along. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2024. Spring was teasing Denver with warm days followed by surprise snowstorms, and I was rushing to get ready for my shift at the coffee shop when my phone rang. Sarah? My mother's voice was strange, tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. Mom? What's wrong? It's Grandma Rose, honey. She had a heart attack in her sleep. She's gone. The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank onto my bed, the phone slipping from suddenly numb fingers. Gone. The one person in my family who had ever truly seen me, who had made me feel valued and important, was gone. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday that perfectly matched the mood of our family. St. Catherine's Catholic Church was filled to capacity, not just with family, but with customers from the bakery, neighbors from Maple Street, and friends Grandma had collected over her 78 years of life. I sat with my parents in the third row, behind Uncle David's family and Aunt Linda's family, listening to eulogy after eulogy about Grandma Rose's business acumen, her community involvement, her generous spirit. Each speaker painted a picture of a woman who had touched countless lives, who had built something lasting and meaningful. But as I sat there, what I remembered wasn't the successful businesswoman or the community leader. I remembered the woman who had taught me to make pie crust from scratch, who had listened to my teenage heartbreaks without judgment, who had saved me a seat at the family table when no one else thought I belonged there. After the service, as we gathered in the church basement for the traditional meal, I noticed my cousins clustered together, talking in hushed tones. There was an energy among them that I couldn't quite identify. Excitement mixed with anxiety, anticipation mixed with dread. It wasn't until later that I understood what I had witnessed. They were already thinking about the will. The law offices of Henderson, Martinez and Associates occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown Denver building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains. On this particular Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Grandma Rose's funeral, those mountains were shrouded in clouds that threatened snow, fitting weather for what was about to unfold. I had never been in a lawyer's office before, and everything about the experience felt surreal. The polished marble floors, the mahogany conference table that could seat 20 people, the leather chairs that probably cost more than my car. It all seemed like a set from a movie, rather than a place where real life happened. My family had arranged themselves around the table with the same hierarchy that governed our dinner gatherings. Uncle David sat closest to the head of the table, his posture radiating the confidence of someone who believed he was about to inherit an empire. Patricia sat beside him, her designer handbag placed strategically on the table like a territorial marker. Aunt Linda and her husband Robert occupied the chairs across from them, with Jessica and Michael flanking their parents like bookends. The twins, Emma and Ethan, sat together, but somehow managed to convey their usual competitive tension even in silence. My parents had chosen seats near the middle of the table, and I found myself in my familiar position, at the far end, practically forgotten. The irony wasn't lost on me that even in death, Grandma Rose was bringing us together around food, or in this case, the table where her final wishes would be served. James Henderson, the senior partner handling Grandma's estate, was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of calm demeanor that probably came from delivering life-changing news on a regular basis. He took his place at the head of the table and opened a thick folder that seemed to contain my grandmother's entire legacy. "Before we begin," Mr. Henderson said, his voice carrying easily through the conference room, "I want to express my condolences to all of you. Rose Mitchell was not only a client, but a friend, and her passing is a great loss to this community." There were murmurs of agreement around the table, but I could sense the underlying tension. Everyone was being polite, but politeness had never been the Mitchell family's strong suit when money was involved. "Rose's will is quite detailed," Mr. Henderson continued, adjusting his reading glasses. "She was very specific about her wishes, and she asked me to read it in its entirety rather than simply summarizing the major bequests. So please, bear with me as we go through this together." He cleared his throat and began to read in the formal language that transforms personal wishes into legal documents. "I, Rose Elizabeth Mitchell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament." The legal preamble seemed to go on forever, but I found myself listening to every word. Somehow, hearing Grandma's intentions spoken aloud made her feel present in the room, as if she were sitting at the table with us, making sure her final wishes were properly understood. "To my son David," Mr. Henderson read, and I saw Uncle David straighten in his chair, "who has dedicated 25 years of his life to building Rose Bakery into the success it is today. I leave the downtown location, including all equipment, inventory, and goodwill associated with that establishment." Uncle David's face broke into a smile, and Patricia reached over to squeeze his hand. The downtown location was the flagship, the most profitable of the 3 bakeries. It was a substantial inheritance, though not the complete empire he had probably expected. "To my daughter Linda," the reading continued, "who chose to pursue knowledge and culture over commerce, I leave my collection of first edition books, my grandmother's china service, and the sum of $50,000 to be used for educational purposes as she sees fit." Aunt Linda nodded approvingly. The book collection alone was worth a small fortune. Grandma had been an avid collector of rare volumes, and the antique china was a family heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations. "To my grandson Brad, I leave the Highlands Ranch Bakery location, with the hope that he will find in it the sense of purpose that has sometimes eluded him." Brad looked surprised, but pleased. The Highlands Ranch location was newer and smaller than downtown, but it served an affluent community and had strong growth potential. To my granddaughter Jessica, I leave my investment portfolio, trusting in her intelligence and education to manage it wisely. Jessica's eyes widened. Grandma's investment portfolio was something the family had speculated about for years, but no one knew its exact value. From Jessica's reaction, it was clearly substantial. To my grandson Michael, I leave the original family home on Maple Street, along with all its contents not otherwise specified in this will. Michael looked stunned. The house was worth at least $500,000, and it held decades of family memories. More than the monetary value, it represented the heart of the Mitchell family legacy. To my granddaughters Emma and Ethan, Mr. Henderson continued, and I noticed he didn't stumble over what would typically be considered a mistake, but had become our family's way of referring to the twins collectively. I leave equal shares in a trust fund that will provide for your college educations and beyond, with the principal to be released when you turn 30. The twins exchanged glances, clearly trying to calculate what their inheritance might be worth. A trust fund that would pay for college and more suggested a significant sum. As Mr. Henderson worked through the list of bequests, I felt a familiar sensation, that of being forgotten, overlooked, invisible. Each of my cousins had received something meaningful, something that reflected both their personalities and their potential value to the family legacy. Even my parents had been mentioned, receiving some of Grandma's jewelry and a modest financial gift, but my name hadn't been called. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that I hadn't expected anything anyway. After all, I was the family afterthought, the granddaughter who had never distinguished herself in business or academics or any of the ways the Mitchell family measured success. But it hurt. God, it hurt more than I had expected. And finally, Mr. Henderson said, and I looked up, realizing there was more. To my granddaughter, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward me, and I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. Here it was, probably some small token, a piece of jewelry or a modest sum that would acknowledge my existence without creating any real change in my circumstances. Who has shown me more genuine care and attention than perhaps I deserved? Who has spent countless hours in my kitchen learning not just recipes, but the art of nurturing others? Who has demonstrated the kind of character that cannot be taught, but must be cultivated through daily choices? Mr. Henderson paused, and I noticed he was looking directly at me now, his expression unreadable. I leave the remainder of my estate, including the third bakery location in Littleton, all business equipment not previously specified, the sum of $200,000 in cash, and most importantly, the secret recipes and formulas that have made Rose Bakery the success it is today. The silence in the room was deafening. I stared at Mr. Henderson, certain I had misheard him. The remainder of the estate? The secret recipes? $200,000? I'm sorry, Uncle David said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Could you repeat that last part? Mr. Henderson calmly reread the bequest, his professional demeanor unchanged despite the tension now crackling through the room like electricity before a thunderstorm. That's impossible, Patricia said, her voice rising. Sarah is barely out of college. She has no business experience, no understanding of what it takes to run a bakery. This has to be a mistake. I can assure you there is no mistake, Mr. Henderson replied calmly. Mrs. Mitchell was very clear about her intentions. In fact, she left a personal letter for Sarah that explains her reasoning. He handed me an envelope with my name written in Grandma's familiar handwriting. My hands were shaking as I took it, aware that everyone at the table was watching my every movement. This is outrageous, Aunt Linda interjected. Mother was clearly not in her right mind when she made these changes. We should contest this will. On what grounds? Mr. Henderson asked, his tone remaining professional but carrying a slight edge. I can assure you that Mrs. Mitchell was thoroughly evaluated by her physician just 2 months ago and found to be in excellent mental health. She also had me witness her signature on 3 separate occasions to ensure there could be no question about her competency. I looked around the table at my family, my uncle's face red with anger, my aunt's eyes calculating the possibilities of a legal challenge, my cousins staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to resentment. The invisible granddaughter had suddenly become the center of attention, and no one seemed happy about it. Perhaps, Mr. Henderson suggested diplomatically, We should take a brief recess to allow everyone to process this information. Sarah, if you'd like to read your grandmother's letter privately, you're welcome to use my office." I nodded gratefully, desperate to escape the stares and whispered conversations that had already begun among my family members. As I stood to follow Mr. Henderson to his office, I heard Uncle David's voice behind me. "This isn't over, Sarah. There's no way we're letting a 23-year-old kid destroy everything our mother built." Mr. Henderson's office was smaller than the conference room, but more personal, with family photos on his desk and diplomas covering one wall. He gestured toward a comfortable chair by the window and closed the door behind him, giving me the privacy I desperately needed. My hands were still trembling as I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. It was written on Grandma's personal stationery, the kind with her initials embossed at the top, and every word was in her careful script. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I hope I managed to surprise everyone one last time. I've always loved a good surprise, haven't I? I imagine you're confused right now, maybe even feeling guilty about what I've left you. Don't. Every decision I made was deliberate and considered, and I want you to understand why. For years I watched our family gatherings with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in what my children and grandchildren have accomplished, but sadness at how they began to see each other, and you, through the lens of competition rather than love. You, my dear girl, were different. While your cousins were busy impressing me with their achievements, you were busy caring for me as a person. You asked about my day, remembered my stories, learned my recipes, not because you wanted something from me, but because you wanted to know me. You have a gift, Sarah. The gift of seeing people for who they really are, not what they can do for you. That's rare in this world, and it's exactly what Rose Bakery needs to survive and thrive in the future. The recipes I'm entrusting to you aren't just formulas for bread and pastries. They're the heart of everything I built, the secret to bringing people together through food. I know you'll use them wisely, not just to make money, but to continue building community. I also know your family will fight this decision. They'll say you're too young, too inexperienced, too ordinary. Prove them wrong, but not by becoming like them. Prove them wrong by staying exactly who you are, someone who leads with kindness, who values people over profit, who understands that success isn't just about what you accumulate, but about what you give back. The money I've left, you should be enough to get you started, but the real treasure is in those recipes and in your own good heart. Trust yourself, Sarah. I do. All my love, Grandma Rose P.S. Check the recipe box in my kitchen. The real secret ingredients were never written down anywhere else. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Grandma Rose hadn't just left me money and property. She had left me her legacy, her trust, and her belief in my potential. But more than that, she had seen something in me that I had never seen in myself. When I returned to the conference room, the atmosphere had shifted from shock to barely concealed hostility. My family members were clustered in small groups, having intense whispered conversations that stopped the moment I walked in. Mr. Henderson resumed his place at the head of the table and addressed the room. "Are there any questions about the bequests as I've read them?" "We want to contest the will," Uncle David said immediately. "This is clearly the result of undue influence. Sarah has manipulated our mother into—" "I would caution you against making such accusations without evidence," Mr. Henderson interrupted smoothly. Mrs. Mitchell was very thorough in documenting her reasoning for these decisions. She anticipated there might be challenges and took steps to ensure her wishes would be protected legally. "What kind of steps?" Aunt Linda asked, her academic mind clearly working through the possibilities. She provided detailed written explanations for each bequest. She was examined by her physician to confirm her mental competency, and she recorded a video message explaining her decisions. All of these documents support the validity of this will. I felt a surge of gratitude for Grandma Rose's foresight. Even in death, she was protecting me from the family politics that had made me feel invisible for so many years. "This is ridiculous," Jessica said, speaking for the first time since the reading began. "Sarah doesn't know anything about running a business. She'll run the bakery into the ground within a year. That's her decision to make," Mr. Henderson replied, "and her responsibility to bear." The meeting concluded with my family members making it clear they intended to challenge the will, despite Mr. Henderson's warnings about the strength of Grandma's legal preparations. As we filed out of the conference room, I found myself walking alone while my relatives clustered together, already planning their strategy. My parents caught up with me at the elevator, their faces a mixture of concern and confusion. "Sarah," my mother said quietly, "are you sure you're ready for this? Running a business is a huge responsibility, and your cousins have a point about your experience." "I don't know, Mom," I admitted. "I don't know if I'm ready. But Grandma Rose believed I could do it, and maybe that's enough to start with." As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, I realized my life had changed completely in the space of an hour. I was no longer the invisible Mitchell granddaughter. I was now the owner of a business, the keeper of family secrets, and the target of family resentment. But for the first time in my life, I was also exactly where someone had wanted me to be. The key to Grandma Rose's house felt heavier than usual in my hand as I stood on the front porch of 1847 Maple Street 3 days after the will reading. The morning sun was filtering through the old oak trees that lined the street, casting dancing shadows across the Victorians' wraparound porch, but I barely noticed the beauty of the scene. My mind was entirely focused on what I might find inside. Since leaving the lawyer's office, I had been living in a strange state of suspended reality. The will contest my family had threatened was already in motion. Uncle David had hired his own attorney, and I'd received papers indicating their intention to challenge Grandma's mental competency at the time she'd updated her will. But Mr. Henderson had assured me that the legal challenges would take months to resolve, and in the meantime, I was the legal inheritor of everything Grandma had left me, including the secrets hidden in her recipe box. The house felt different without Grandma's presence filling it. Not empty exactly, but waiting, like a theater between performances, holding its breath for the next act to begin. I walked through the familiar rooms, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, remembering all the family gatherings these walls had witnessed. The kitchen was exactly as Grandma had left it. Her apron still hung on the hook beside the stove, and the lingering scent of cinnamon and vanilla seemed permanently woven into the very air. This was where I had learned to cook, where I had spent countless hours listening to stories while helping prepare meals that brought our fractured family together, however temporarily. The recipe box sat on the counter where it had always been, a simple wooden container that looked unremarkable from the outside. I had seen it thousands of times, had even used some of the index cards inside when helping Grandma prepare family dinners, but I had never looked closely at it, never examined it with the attention it apparently deserved. Now, as I approached it with the reverence usually reserved for sacred artifacts, I noticed details that had escaped my attention before. The wood was older than I had realized, worn smooth by decades of handling. There were tiny scratches and stains that told the story of years of use, and when I lifted it, I discovered something I had never noticed before. It was heavier than it should have been for a simple collection of recipe cards. I opened the lid with trembling fingers, and what I found inside made me gasp. The recipe box had a false bottom. The regular recipes were there, the ones I had used countless times for Sunday dinners and holiday preparations. But underneath, in a hidden compartment that I discovered by accident when one of the cards caught on something, was a completely different collection of documents. These weren't just recipes, they were formulas, written in Grandma's meticulous handwriting, but with a level of detail and precision that went far beyond anything I had seen before. Each card contained not just ingredients and measurements, but specific techniques, timing notes, temperature specifications, and most intriguingly, handwritten observations about what made each recipe special. The first card I pulled from the hidden compartment was for something called Rose's Golden Bread. I recognized it immediately. This was the bread that had made Rose Bakery famous, the one that customers would line up for every morning, the one that other bakeries had tried unsuccessfully to replicate for years. But this version of the recipe was unlike anything I had seen before. Where the regular recipe card simply listed ingredients and basic instructions, this one read like a scientific document combined with a love letter to the art of baking. Rose's Golden Bread, the true recipe. The secret isn't in the ingredients themselves, but in the relationship between them and the understanding that bread is alive. Every loaf has its own personality, and a good baker learns to listen to what the dough is telling them. Special flour blend, 60% bread flour, 25% whole wheat, 15% semolina. The semolina must be very fine. If you can't find fine semolina, process regular semolina in the food processor for 30 seconds. The honey must be raw and unfiltered. Commercial honey lacks the enzymes that create the complex flavor profile we're seeking. Fermentation time varies with weather and humidity. In summer, reduce time by 30 minutes. In winter, extend by 45 minutes. Listen to the dough. It will tell you when it's ready by the sound it makes when you tap the container. A ready dough has a hollow, musical sound. Most importantly, the final proof must happen in a warm, humid environment. I use the oven with just the light on and a pan of steaming water on the bottom rack. The steam is crucial. It's what creates the golden color and the crust that has just enough give to yield to your teeth, but enough strength to hold the soft interior. I stared at the card, reading it again and again. This wasn't just a recipe. It was a master class in understanding the science and art behind baking. Every note revealed layers of knowledge that had been accumulated over decades of experimentation and refinement. I pulled out another card, Grandmother's Apple Cinnamon Rolls, the complete method. Again, the level of detail was extraordinary. The card contained not just the recipe, but notes about apple varieties, Honey Crisp for sweetness, Granny Smith for tartness, combined 2.1 ratio for perfect balance, cinnamon sources, Ceylon cinnamon only, Cassia cinnamon is too harsh and will overpower the apple flavor, and even specific rolling techniques. Roll from the center outward in both directions to maintain even thickness. The dough should be exactly 1/4 inch thick. Any thinner, and the filling will leak. Any thicker, and the rolls won't cook evenly. As I worked through the hidden collection, I began to understand why Rose Bakery had been so successful, and why other bakeries had never been able to replicate Grandma's products. These weren't just recipes, they were the result of decades of experimentation, observation, and refinement. Each formula represented countless hours of trial and error, of understanding not just what to do, but why it worked. But there was something else in the hidden compartment that made me pause. Mixed in with the recipe cards were what appeared to be business documents, supplier contracts, pricing strategies, and most intriguingly, detailed financial records that painted a very different picture of Rose Bakery's success than what I had understood. According to these records, the bakery wasn't just successful, it was extraordinarily profitable. The numbers I was seeing suggested that Grandma had been significantly underreporting the business's earnings, possibly for tax purposes, or more likely, to avoid the kind of family fighting that substantial wealth tends to create. But the most shocking discovery was a folder labeled Future Plans in Grandma's handwriting. Inside, I found detailed business projections, expansion plans, and market analysis that revealed the scope of her ambitions for Rose Bakery. She hadn't just been running a neighborhood bakery. She had been building the foundation for a regional empire. The plans called for expansion into catering, wholesale distribution to restaurants, and even franchising opportunities. There were supplier agreements already negotiated, equipment specifications researched, and financial projections that suggested Rose Bakery could become a multi-million-dollar operation within 5 years. And according to the documents, she had been planning to implement these expansions with me as her successor. I found a business plan dated just 6 months before her death, written in her careful handwriting. Sarah has shown the most promise of all my grandchildren for understanding what makes Rose Bakery special. She doesn't see the business as just a way to make money, but as a way to bring people together and create something meaningful in the community. David understands operations, but lacks vision. Linda has vision, but no practical business sense. The other grandchildren are too focused on their own careers to give the bakery the attention it deserves. Sarah asks the right questions. She wants to know why we do things a certain way, not just how to do them. She understands that our customers aren't just buying bread and pastries, they're buying comfort, tradition, and a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. If she's willing to take on the challenge, I believe she could transform Rose Bakery into something extraordinary. I sat at Grandma's kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence of her faith in me, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat. This wasn't just about inheriting a bakery. It was about inheriting a vision, a dream that Grandma Rose had been nurturing for years. But it was also about proving myself to a family that had never believed in me, and more importantly, proving to myself that their lack of faith had been wrong. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed my mother's number. "Hi, Mom." "Sarah, honey, where are you? I've been calling all morning." "I'm at Grandma's house, going through some things." There was a pause, and I could hear the concern in my mother's voice when she spoke again. "Sweetheart, I know you're excited about the inheritance, but you need to be realistic about this. Your Uncle David is serious about contesting the will, and even if he doesn't succeed, running a business is incredibly difficult. Maybe you should consider selling your share to the family and using the money for something more practical, like paying off your student loans or putting a down payment on a house." It was exactly the kind of well-meaning but deflating advice I had been receiving my entire life. Be practical. Don't take risks. Accept your limitations. "Mom," I said, looking at the business plans spread across Grandma's kitchen table, "what if I don't want to be practical? What if I want to try something extraordinary?" Another pause. "Sarah, I just don't want to see you get hurt. This family can be difficult when money is involved." "I know, Mom, but maybe it's time someone in this family took a real risk on something that matters." After I hung up, I spent the rest of the afternoon studying Grandma's hidden documents. The more I read, the more I understood that her bequest to me wasn't just about the recipes or the money. It was about the opportunity to build something meaningful, something that could change not just my life, but the lives of everyone who worked at and frequented Rose Bakery. But first, I had to learn how to actually use these secret recipes. I decided to start with the golden bread, partly because it was Rose Bakery's signature product, and partly because bread had always been my favorite thing to bake with Grandma. I gathered the ingredients according to her precise specifications, noting how different some of them were from what I had used in the simplified versions of her recipes. The flour blend alone was a revelation. Instead of the standard bread flour I had always used, this recipe called for a specific combination that included semolina, which I had to track down at a specialty grocery store. The honey had to be raw and unfiltered, which meant a trip to the farmer's market where I found a local beekeeper who sold exactly what I needed. As I began the mixing process, following Grandma's detailed instructions, I found myself paying attention to details I had never noticed before. The texture of the dough at different stages, the way it responded to kneading, the subtle changes in color and elasticity that indicated proper gluten development. But most importantly, I began to understand what Grandma had meant about listening to the dough. There was a rhythm to the process, a conversation between baker and ingredients that went beyond simply following instructions. The dough had its own personality, its own needs, and learning to respond to those needs was what separated good baking from extraordinary baking. The first loaf I pulled from the oven looked promising, but when I cut into it, I knew immediately that something was different from the Rose Bakery bread I remembered. The color was right, the texture was close, but the flavor was missing something, a depth and complexity that had made Grandma's bread unforgettable. I went back to the recipe card and read it more carefully. Hidden in the margins, in Grandma's faintest handwriting, I found additional notes that I had missed on my first reading. The secret ingredient isn't an ingredient at all. It's time and attention. Each loaf must be treated as if it's the only loaf you'll ever make. The dough can sense your intentions. If you're rushing, if you're distracted, if you're baking for the wrong reasons, it will show in the final product. Bake with love, but also with respect for the process and the people who will eat what you create. That's what makes the difference between bread and communion. I started over, this time approaching the process with the reverence it apparently required. I took my time with each step, paying attention not just to the technical requirements, but to the spirit behind them. I thought about the customers who would eat this bread, about the comfort and nourishment it would provide, about the tradition I was continuing. The second loaf was better, much better. When I cut into it, the crumb had the perfect texture, soft and tender, but with enough structure to hold together. The crust had the ideal balance of crispness and give, and the flavor. The flavor was complex and satisfying in a way that made me understand why people had been willing to wait in line for this bread. But it still wasn't quite right. There was something missing, some essential element that would transform good bread into the legendary golden bread that had built Rose Bakery's reputation. I was pondering this mystery when I heard a knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered not answering. But the knocking persisted, and eventually curiosity won out. When I opened the door, I found my cousin Jessica standing on the porch, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Hi, Sarah," she said, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "Can we talk?" I invited her in, though I was wary. Jessica had never sought out my company before, and given the family's reaction to the will reading, I doubted this was a social call. She followed me into the living room, her eyes taking in the familiar surroundings with what looked like nostalgia mixed with something else, envy, perhaps, or regret. "I wanted to apologize," she said, surprising me, "for how we reacted at the lawyer's office. It was a shock, you know? We all expected things to go differently." "I understand," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I did. Jessica sat down on Grandma's sofa, the same spot where she had always claimed during family gatherings, and for a moment she looked younger, more vulnerable than the confident law student I was used to seeing. "The thing is," she continued, "I've been thinking about what Grandma wrote in her will, about why she chose you, and I think maybe she was right." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "What do you mean?" Jessica sighed, running her hands through her perfectly styled hair. "I mean that maybe the rest of us have been so focused on impressing Grandma with our achievements that we forgot to actually know her as a person. You were the only one who spent time with her just because you wanted to, not because you were trying to get something from her." This was not the conversation I had expected to have with Jessica, and I wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm not trying to butter you up or anything," she said quickly, apparently reading my skepticism. "Dad is still planning to contest the will, and honestly, I think some of the family will never get over this, but I wanted you to know that not all of us think you're unqualified." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. Jessica's approval hadn't mattered to me before, but in this moment, it felt like a lifeline. "There's something else," she said, looking nervous again. "I don't know if you remember, but when we were kids, Grandma used to let me help her in the kitchen sometimes, before I got distracted by other things." I did remember, vaguely. There had been a period when Jessica was maybe 10 or 11 when she had shown genuine interest in cooking and baking, but it had ended abruptly when she started focusing on academics and eventually seemed to forget that phase of her life entirely. "She taught me some things that weren't in the regular recipes," Jessica continued. "Little tricks and techniques that she said were family secrets. I always thought she had taught them to everyone, but after listening to the family talk this week, I'm realizing that maybe she only shared them with the people she thought would appreciate them." "What kind of things?" Jessica smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, it looked completely genuine. "Things like how the weather affects rising times, how to tell when bread is really done by the sound it makes when you tap it, how to adjust recipes based on the altitude and humidity, practical things that make the difference between good baking and great baking. Would you be willing to share them with me? That's why I'm here." We spent the next 2 hours in Grandma's kitchen, with Jessica teaching me the subtle techniques that she had learned as a child and somehow never forgotten. She showed me how to test dough by pressing it gently with a floured finger, how to create the perfect environment for proofing by adjusting the oven temperature and humidity, and most importantly, how to recognize when bread was ready by a dozen different sensory cues that went far beyond simply following a timer. "The thing about Grandma's baking," Jessica explained as we worked together, "is that she never did anything by rote. Every loaf was a conversation between her and the ingredients, and she adjusted constantly based on what she was seeing and feeling and even hearing. As she spoke, I realized that this was the missing element in my attempts to recreate the golden bread. I had been following the recipe like a formula, but baking at Grandma's level required intuition, experience, and a willingness to trust my senses over rigid instructions. When we made another batch of golden bread together, incorporating Jessica's insights with the secret recipe I had discovered, the result was transformative. This loaf had the complexity and depth of flavor that I remembered from Rose Bakery, the perfect balance of sweetness and substance that made it impossible to eat just one slice. "There it is," Jessica said, tasting the bread with obvious satisfaction. "That's Grandma's bread." As we cleaned up the kitchen together, Jessica made an observation that stayed with me long after she left. "You know, Sarah, I think Grandma knew exactly what she was doing when she left you the recipes. It wasn't just about rewarding you for being kind to her, though that was part of it. I think she saw something in you that the rest of us missed, the ability to carry forward not just her business, but her values, the understanding that food is about more than profit." After Jessica left, I sat in Grandma's kitchen as the sun set outside, surrounded by the evidence of my successful bread-making experiment and the lingering warmth of an unexpected reconciliation with a cousin I had never really known. For the first time since the will reading, I began to believe that maybe I could do this. Maybe I could honor Grandma's faith in me and build something extraordinary from the foundation she had left me. But first, I had to survive the family war that was just beginning. The phone call came at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after my successful bread-making session with Jessica. I was still staying at Grandma's house, partly because it felt closer to her memory and partly because my tiny apartment didn't have the space to practice the complex recipes I was learning from her secret collection. "Sarah, you need to get down to the Littleton Bakery right now." The voice belonged to Maria Santos, the manager who had been running the location for the past 5 years. She sounded panicked. "What's wrong?" I asked, instantly alert despite the early hour. "There's been a break-in, or, well, maybe not a break-in exactly, but someone came in last night and destroyed 3 batches of bread dough and dumped flour all over the kitchen. The police are here, but I think you should see this." 20 minutes later, I stood in the doorway of the Littleton Bakery, staring at what looked like the aftermath of a food fight conducted by angry toddlers. White flour covered every surface, and the carefully prepared dough for the morning's bread service lay destroyed in sticky heaps across the floor. Officer Patricia Williams, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had seen everything, approached me with a clipboard and a sympathetic expression. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm sorry about this mess. The good news is that whoever did this didn't actually break in. They had a key. The bad news is that means it was probably someone with authorized access." My heart sank as the implications became clear. Only family members and longtime employees had keys to the bakery, and given the timing, just days after I had officially taken ownership, the list of suspects was uncomfortably short. "Was anything stolen?" I asked. "That's the strange part," Officer Williams replied. "Nothing appears to be missing. This seems more like vandalism than theft. Someone wanted to send a message rather than take anything of value." I knew exactly what message they were trying to send. "You don't belong here." Maria showed me around the destroyed kitchen, cataloging the damage with the expertise of someone who had been working in commercial kitchens for most of her adult life. At 53, she was a small, energetic woman who had immigrated from Mexico 20 years ago and worked her way up from dishwasher to manager through sheer determination and an instinctive understanding of what made a bakery successful. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing," she said grimly. "They didn't just make a random mess. They specifically targeted the bread dough and the flour supplies. They wanted to make sure we couldn't open this morning. Can we recover? Is there any way to still serve customers today?" Maria considered the question with the practical eye of someone who had dealt with kitchen disasters before. "If we start right now and work straight through, we can have a limited selection ready by noon, but it means everyone works a double shift and we'll have to pay overtime to the whole staff." "Do it," I said without hesitation. "Whatever it costs." As Maria began calling in the full staff for an emergency restoration effort, I found myself thinking about the psychology of whoever had done this. They hadn't wanted to steal from me or cause permanent damage to the bakery. They had wanted to create a crisis that would test my resolve and maybe convince me that owning a business was more trouble than it was worth. But they had underestimated both my stubbornness and the loyalty of the people who actually worked at Rose Bakery. Within an hour, the kitchen was buzzing with activity as employees who should have been home sleeping worked alongside me to restore order and begin the day's production. I watched in amazement as this team of people, most of whom I barely knew, threw themselves into the recovery effort with a dedication that went far beyond what their paychecks required. "Why are you all doing this?" I asked Rosa, one of the bakers who had been with the company for 8 years. "You could have just called in sick and avoided this whole mess." Rosa, a grandmother of 4 who could shape dinner rolls faster than anyone I had ever seen, looked at me as if the question itself was puzzling. "Mija," she said, using the Spanish term of endearment that I had heard her apply to everyone from toddlers to senior citizens. "This is our place too. When someone attacks the bakery, they attack all of us. Besides, your grandmother was good to us. The least we can do is be good to her granddaughter." As we worked together to rebuild the morning's production, I began to understand something that the business books I had been reading couldn't teach. A successful bakery wasn't just about recipes and profit margins. It was about building a community of people who cared about the work they were doing and the customers they served. By noon, we had managed to produce a limited but respectable selection of bread, pastries, and sandwiches. The regular customers who came in seemed to sense that something unusual had happened, but instead of being annoyed by the reduced selection, many of them offered words of encouragement and support. "Heard you're Rose's granddaughter," said Mr. Peterson, a retired teacher who came in every Tuesday for coffee and a cinnamon roll. "She used to talk about you all the time, said you had the best instincts of anyone in the family." Mrs. Chen, who owned the flower shop next door, stopped by to offer her condolences about Grandma and her congratulations about the inheritance. "Your grandmother helped me get started when I opened my shop 10 years ago," she said. "Gave me advice about dealing with suppliers and even lent me money when the bank wouldn't. If you're anything like her, this neighborhood is lucky to have you." As the day progressed and we managed to serve most of our regular customers, despite the morning's chaos, I felt a growing sense of confidence. The vandalism had been meant to discourage me, but instead, it had shown me the strength of the community that Grandma Rose had built around her business. But the real test was still to come. That evening, as I was helping close the bakery and planning for the next day's production, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Uncle David's number. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Can you meet me at the downtown location tomorrow morning before we open?" "What about?" "About the future of this family and this business. I think it's time we had an honest conversation." The downtown Rose Bakery location occupied a corner building in Denver's historic Lodo district, with large windows that showcased the baking activity inside and outdoor seating that was always full during good weather. It was the flagship location, the one that had established Rose Bakery's reputation, and walking into it felt like entering the heart of Grandma's legacy. Uncle David was waiting for me when I arrived at 7 in the morning. He stood behind the main counter with the confidence of someone who belonged there, wearing a Rose Bakery apron over his business clothes. At 54, he had inherited Grandma's sturdy build and practical manner, but where her eyes had always held warmth, his were calculating. "Thanks for coming," he said, gesturing toward a small table in the corner where we could talk privately. "I wanted to have this conversation before the lawyers get more involved, and everything becomes about legal strategies instead of family relationships." I sat down across from him, waiting to see where this was going. "I'm going to be direct with you, Sarah, because I think you deserve honesty. The will contest is going to be expensive and ugly, and it could drag on for years. Even if you ultimately win, the legal fees and family damage might not be worth it. What are you proposing?" "A compromise. You sell me your share of the inheritance for a fair price, let's say $300,000, which is more than the assessed value of the Littleton location, plus the cash you inherited. You walk away with enough money to pay off your student loans, buy a house, maybe start your own business someday, and the family stops fighting." It was a generous offer, probably more than I could get if I tried to sell my inheritance on the open market. But it was also exactly what I had expected from Uncle David, a practical solution that ignored the deeper meaning of what Grandma Rose had done. "And if I say no?" His expression hardened slightly. "Then we continue with the legal challenge. And I have to tell you, Sarah, our lawyer thinks we have a strong case. Your grandmother was 78 years old. She had recently lost several close friends, and there's evidence that she was becoming increasingly isolated and dependent on you for companionship. A good lawyer could argue that constitutes undue influence." "Is that what you really think happened? That I manipulated Grandma into changing her will?" Uncle David was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, more conflicted. "No," he admitted. "I don't think you deliberately manipulated her, but I do think she made an emotional decision based on sentiment rather than practical considerations. Sarah, you're a sweet kid, and Mom loved you, but running a bakery chain isn't about being loved. It's about understanding profit margins and supplier relationships and employee management and a dozen other things that take years to learn. Then teach me." He looked surprised. "What?" "If the problem is that I don't know enough about the business side, then teach me. Work with me instead of fighting me. Show me what I need to know to be successful." "Sarah, it's not that simple." "Why not? You've spent 25 years learning this business. I've spent 23 years learning Grandma's recipes and understanding what makes her food special. Together, we probably know everything there is to know about running Rose Bakery." I could see him considering the idea, weighing the practical benefits against his assumption that he should be in charge. "What would that look like?" he asked finally. "Partnership. You handle the business operations, I handle the creative and culinary side. We make major decisions together, and we split the profits according to our ownership shares. And what about the other family members? They're not going to be happy about being cut out entirely. Then we find ways to include them. Jessica has good business instincts. Maybe she could help with marketing or legal issues. Michael has his degree in hospitality management. Maybe he could help with expansion planning. Emma and Ethan are both studying business. Maybe they could work part-time and learn the industry from the ground up. Uncle David stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him reassessing his assumptions about my capabilities. You've really thought about this, haven't you? Every day since the will reading. Uncle David, I know you don't think I'm qualified to run this business. Maybe you're right. But I also know that Grandma didn't choose me randomly. She saw something in me that made her believe I could do this, and I owe it to her memory to at least try. He was quiet for several minutes, looking out the window at the morning commuters beginning to fill the sidewalks outside. Finally, he turned back to me. There's something you should know, he said, about the vandalism at the Littleton location yesterday. My stomach dropped. You know who did it? I know who arranged it. It was Patricia's idea. She thought if you had to deal with some operational problems right away, you might realize you were in over your head and be more willing to sell. I felt a flash of anger, but also something like relief. At least now I knew where the attack had come from, and it wasn't from one of the employees I had been beginning to trust. Are you going to tell the police? No. Patricia is my wife, and she was trying to protect what she thought were the family's interests. But I've told her that if anything like that happens again, I'll turn her in myself. And what about the will contest? Uncle David sighed, suddenly looking older than his 54 years. I'll talk to the lawyer. Maybe we can work out a partnership agreement instead of fighting over who owns what. As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter than I had since Grandma's death. The vandalism had been solved, the family war might be ending, and most importantly, I was beginning to believe that I really could honor Grandma Rose's faith in me. But the biggest test was still ahead, proving that I could not only run Rose Bakery, but help it grow into the empire that Grandma had envisioned. The grand opening of Rose Bakery's 4th location, a cafe and catering operation in Denver's trendy Rhino district, drew a crowd that stretched around the block. As I stood behind the counter, wearing Grandma's old apron and watching customers enjoy the golden bread and other recipes I had perfected using her secret formulas, I thought about how much had changed since that shocking morning in the lawyer's office. The family partnership had worked better than anyone expected. Uncle David handled operations and finance, I managed recipes and quality control, and my cousins had found their own niches within the growing business. Jessica had proven to be a natural at marketing and public relations. Michael had developed an expansion strategy that balanced growth with quality, and even the twins had contributed by creating an online ordering system that had boosted our catering business. Most importantly, we had maintained the community focus that had always been the heart of Rose Bakery. Each location employed local residents, sourced ingredients from regional suppliers, and served as a gathering place for neighbors who wanted more than just good food. They wanted connection. As I watched families sharing meals, business people conducting meetings over coffee, and elderly customers chatting with young parents, I understood what Grandma Rose had really left me. It wasn't just a business or a collection of recipes or even a substantial inheritance. She had left me the opportunity to prove that being invisible for 23 years had actually been preparation for being exactly the person this community needed. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged.